Hello everyone! Today I'm going to present our new work about self-supervised learning. This is Emanuele Sansone and the work has been done jointly with Robin Manave at K11. Everyone is familiar with ChatGPT. ChatGPT is a language model which takes in input a query in terms of text and produces a textual answer to your query. ChatGPT has achieved impressive performance in question answering. We have also vision models such as text-to-image generation models, which takes in input a sequence of tokens, concepts, and are able to draw the concepts in the form of an image. The picture here is taken from the DALL-E 2 paper. On one side, we have language models, and on the other we have vision ones. Here there is a list of models developed by OpenAI, but of course the list is not comprehensive, it's not exhaustive. There are plenty of them in the literature. What is really important is how these models are trained. Indeed, there is a common learning algorithm used to train such models, and that common algorithm is self-supervised learning. Now, let's have a brief recap about self-supervised learning. In order to understand it, let's first consider supervised learning. In supervised learning, you have a set of images with the corresponding labels. You want to train your model to be able to mimic the labels for your images. The problem is that when you have a new task, for instance new categories, you have to retrain your model with the new labels. Of course, this is expensive in terms of supervision. Self-supervised learning enables you to learn a model without providing the labels. The only thing you need is an objective, a self-supervised learning task, which exploits the information already contained in the images. So when you have a new task, you just need to update a small portion of your model, and therefore you can reduce the need for additional labels. Now, let's consider the models I was mentioning before from OpenAI, and consider this plot, where we have on the x-axis the time, and on the other hand we have the model size. The first language model was GPT-1, released in 2018. Subsequently, OpenAI evolved the model up to GPT-3, which is at the basis of ChatGPT. From the computer vision perspective, the recent model developed by OpenAI is DALL-E 2. Now, the question is, where is our solution placing in comparison to these models? Perhaps here? And the answer is no. We are at a much smaller scale. And the reason for that is simply because we do not have the resources that OpenAI has. So now the question is, what is our contribution? What are we doing new with respect to existing algorithms? Well, to answer these questions, let's consider this new plot, where on the x-axis we have the training dataset size, so the number of samples we use to learn to train our model, which can be quantified in terms of number of tokens if we consider text, or number of images if we consider computer vision applications. And on the other side, we still have the model size, so the number of parameters. Now, let's place the models we have seen so far on this plot. We clearly see that there is a relation between these two factors, between the training dataset size and the model size. And our solution actually places on a regime that is totally different from these models. So the advantage of our solution is that we are able to exploit data more efficiently. We are now ready to provide our solution called GEDI. GEDI stands for Generative and Discriminative Training for Self-Supervised Learning. Remember, the question we want to address is, how can we exploit data more efficiently? And in order to answer these questions, we are going to follow these points. So we first provide an interpretation, a Bayesian analysis of self-supervised learning objectives. We then provide a general recipe, our solution called GEDI. And then finally, we are going to provide an instantiation, a solution, a learning algorithm to train the model, and we show some experiments validating our claims. So let's start with the analysis. In the literature, there are three main families of self-supervised learning objectives. There are contrastive approaches, there are cluster-based or discriminative approaches, and then we have negative-free and non-contrastive approaches. So for the analysis, we are going to consider the following ingredients, the following quantities. So we have X, which is our raw data. We have the latent representation as the output of our encoder, which is Xi. We have an embedding representation, which is the output of the composition of the projector and encoder, W. And then finally, we have our symbolic representation, which is Y. So it considers the categorical variables about our data, underlying our data. So for contrastive methods, actually we are using a subset of them, and we can devise the following objective probabilistic graphical model. So we consider a set of training samples from x1 to xn. So this could be n images, n documents, and so on. And then we define an indicator variable L, which just scan over this training dataset. So the conditional distribution of L given x is just providing information about which document we are considering. So if we are considering document xi, we want to have that the indicator variable has higher mass in the corresponding index, so the corresponding training example. And this can be done by defining the following density, where we use a similarity score between the embeddings of our images. Now, the data log likelihood can be expressed in the following form. So we have a red term, the negative entropy, and a blue term, which we call contrastive term. So the first term, the negative entropy, actually does not influence the learning of our model. However, the second term is actually the main part that is used during training. So importantly, by choosing a proper similarity function and also choosing the proper blocks for our model, the projector and encoder, we get existing objectives available nowadays in the literature of contrastive learning. So we have contrastive predictive coding, SimCLR, prototypical noise contrastive estimation, prototypical contrastive predictive coding, K-shot contrastive learning, and so on. We can also do the same analysis for cluster-based methods. Here we consider a different subset of ingredients, and the corresponding probabilistic graphical model is defined as in the slide. So we have X, our image, our document, and then we have X prime, which is just a transformed version of our original image. So for example, we perturb the image by adding some noise, by rotating, by cropping, or doing some other transformation. And then what we do is that we define the conditional probabilities densities. So we have P of y given x, which is just a classifier, and then a probabilistic classifier, and Q of y given x prime is a distribution on the vocabulary, on the symbols, and it is different for each of the inputs. Now, the data log likelihood can be lower bounded by the following quantity, where we have one term in red, which is again the negative entropy, and we have another term which consists of two addends, and this is called the optimal transport objective. So here, in this objective, we are actually optimizing with respect to Q, density Q, and the density P. So in order to understand the behavior of such objective, let's consider the maximization of that with respect to Q. So the second addend in the objective, actually in the blue objective, enforces maximum entropy. So that means that our Q tends to be uniform over our symbols. The first addend in the objective, in the blue objective, enforces Q to be close to P, or P close to Q. So one of the solutions of such objective is a trivial solution where P and Q are the same, and Q is completely uniform. And that's actually an undesired solution, because if Q is uniform, it's assigning a random symbol irrespective of the image that is in input. So we disregard the information in the image, and that's not a desired solution. So people what typically do is that they use some alternating strategy between optimizing Q and P, and there are some, depending on the algorithm that you use, you can end up on different strategies, like for example deep cluster, SVAV, and many others. Now let's consider the last family of approaches, which are negative free approaches. Here we consider another set of ingredients, and the probabilistic graphical model that we can devise is the following. So it might be scary at the beginning, but let's go through them. Let's go through it. Again, we have x and x prime, and then we have our embedding and our latent representation. So we have to define the conditional distribution of x prime given x and c, which is simply our augmentation strategy. We have the conditional distribution of p of w given x, and that's actually a Gaussian with zero mean and identity covariance. And then finally we have the prior over xc, the latent representation, which is again a Gaussian distribution. So now what we do is that we define the auxiliary distribution for the dashed arrows. And they are defined in this way. So if we have q of w given x, we have a Gaussian distribution with zero mean and a covariance matrix that is equal to the sample covariance of our embeddings. Q of c given x and x prime instead is equal to a Gaussian distribution, but this time the mean value is equal to the difference between the output of the encoder for the image and its augmented version, whereas the covariance matrix is just an identity matrix. So this is the full graphical model. Let's see what is the objective, and let's try to understand what is actually doing. So the data log likelihood can be lower bounded according to this quantity. So again, we have a negative entropy term, and then we have two terms highlighted in blue, which are two distances. And actually the two distances are computing a distance with respect to the auxiliary density of w given x with respect to the prior over w, so over the embeddings. And the second distance is computing a distance of the auxiliary distribution over the latent representation with respect to the prior over the latent representation. So the first distance actually is ensuring what? So let's go to checking the tables in our definition of our conditional distributions. So we have QW given X and PW. So what we see is that they are both Gaussian and the mean value is 0 for both of them, whereas the covariance matrix is different. So this distance actually is enforcing that the covariance matrix sigma W gets closer to the identity matrix. So what is implying is that is implying that the features of the embedding, so the elements of our embedding representation, tend to be decorrelated from each other. The second distance instead forces the auxiliary distribution over the latent representation to be close as possible to the prior of the latent representation. And again, let's see the definition of the conditional distributions. Well, we see that both of them are Gaussian distributed, but this time what's happening is that they have similar covariance matrix, they have the same covariance matrix, but they have different mean values. So what is actually doing this term is enforcing that the mean value of the latent representation, so the difference between the output of the encoder for the image and its augmented version, tend to be the same. So that term enforces that the latent representation is invariant to certain augmentations. So the two distances actually are enforcing two different things. One is enforcing that the elements of our embedding are decorrelated, while the second term enforces the augmentation invariance. And actually the phenomena that we have described so far can be also reconducted to existing objectives like Barlow twins, VCREGs, and so on. So we can summarize our analysis into a common framework. So here I provided a set of objectives, the one that I just mentioned, and I just use some compact name to simplify, let's say, the notation. And we can summarize everything in a single graphical model with a single objective. So that's actually our analysis about self-supervised learning. Okay, so let's focus now on our solution, GEDI, and provide a general recipe. Here I placed the objective that we have devised before about the summary of existing self-supervised learning approaches. So remember that we were not putting any attention on the red term. And actually, if we introduced a generative model, we can express the negative entropy in the following form, lower bounding the negative entropy in the following form. So P of psi is actually our generative model. So now, by replacing this inequality into the main objective, we get our GEDI objective. So we have the red term, which is the log likelihood of a generative model, and two terms here, or more terms, which are the discriminative part about self-supervised learning. So now what we can do is that we have a unified objective that allows us to consider all possible likelihood-based models like variational autoencoder, normalizing flows, energy-based models, and so on, together with self-supervised learning. So now we try to instantiate GEDI with our new solution. So again, this is the objective we are having, this is the GEDI objective, and now we have to define what is P of psi. So P of psi in our case is just an energy-based model, for example, where we are just reusing the blocks we were having before. So our model just introduces a small linear layer to produce an energy score and then defines our energy-based model. So now the question is, how can we leverage the properties of both generative and self-supervised learning during training? Remember, generative models are good at performing implicit density estimation. Deep generative models are good at doing implicit density estimation, while self-supervised learning are good at representing data. So how can we leverage the properties of these two families? And the solution we propose is the data augmentation based on manifold structure strategy. So what is this technique? Well, let's consider what's happening when we consider the energy model. So the energy model actually provides an energy over the input space. And actually the arrows here highlighted in gray actually are providing the information about where the higher mass is placed by the energy model. Okay, so they point towards the regions of higher mass. Whereas the black curve actually is the region, the manifold, with the highest mass. Okay, so X in our case corresponds to our training samples, and what we can do is that we can place, for example, a ball of arbitrarily small size. We can sample over this ball a vector, and then what we can do is that we can exploit the vector field induced by the energy model to project the vector onto the tangent plane of the manifold. So we can repeat this process up to several steps to produce a new image, a new augmentation. But this time the augmentation is not based on the augmentation strategies commonly used in the literature, but is based on the information provided by the energy model, so is along the manifold. So now what we can do is that we can use the two augmented samples, so the original image and its augmented sample, and ensure that both samples have the same symbols. And this is done by the objective in the self-supervised learning part. So how do we train this model? Well, first of all, we have to pre-train the energy-based model to have a good energy-based model. And then once we have trained such model, we can then use our GEDI objective and train all together. Okay, so now let's focus on the experiments. We are conducting some analysis on these datasets. We start from toy data, then we consider common benchmarks in the literature of computer vision for evaluating typically machine learning models, and then we apply the algorithm to discovering symbols in a neurosymbolic setting. Our baselines are energy-based models, and we consider a recent energy-based model like GEM. And then we have two self-supervised learning approaches based on cluster-based methods, SWAV, and negative free ones, Barlow twins. So for the toy cases, we consider two datasets which are really simple in 2 dimensions. And here what we see is that we see that the dots, okay, corresponds to a particular sample, and the color of the dots correspond to gives us information that those samples with the same color should have the same symbol, should belong to the same cluster. to the same class. So SWAV, for example, is able to really perform well on the MOONS datasets. However, when the dataset has particular symmetry, like in the case of two concentric circles, the performance drops significantly. And that's because it's not able to exploit the underlying structure in the data. While GEDI, in our case, thanks to our property of exploiting both generative and self-supervised learning model, is able to solve the issue. Now let's consider more quantitative experiments, where here we show the performance over an increasing number of steps on the manifold. So we see that while the energy-based model fails in both cases, and this is kind of reasonable because it's not really learned to learn a symbolic representation, SWAV instead is able to learn perfectly on the MOONS dataset, but fails on the circle dataset. However, our model is able to perform well in both settings, and once we increase the number of steps on the manifold, we are able to boost the performance. So far we have considered only toy settings, so we have exploited the manifold structure underlying the data, but is this a valid assumption in the real case? Well, then we can consider some real settings, some datasets that are commonly used in computer vision, like SVHN, CIFAR 10, and CIFAR 100, and we clearly see that the performance are improved significantly. So that's a strong evidence that such unification is really powerful. We can also provide an application in terms of symbol discovery, and so here we consider a sequence of images, for example from NIST. So here we have a 3, a 5, and an 8, and there is an underlying rule that governs the dynamics of such a sequence. So for example, the first two images are summed together to give the last image. So here 3 plus 5 give an 8. So what we can do is that we can use our model, okay, to encode the image into the symbols. So we have a symbolic representation for each of the images. Then we can use a reasoner, which is developed in our lab, Problem, that encodes the information about the rules. So what's happening is that now what we can do is that we can train using both Problem or without Problem together with GEDI, our objective, and see if we can learn the representation, the symbolic representation properly in different regimes of data. This is an important experiment because previous neurosymbolic solutions were failing in such setting. So, and the reason for this is that there exists a trivial solution corresponding to the case where y1, y2, and y3 are both the same and are equal to 0. So that solution is actually the solution in which many approaches converge to. So instead, we want to ask here if we are able to get to learn a symbolic representation that is meaningful, so that it doesn't collapse to the trivial solution. And actually that is the case, without and with the constraint. But importantly, what we can also say is that without the constraint, so without the Problem, without the reasoner, what we are able to do is that we are able to discover quite good the symbolic representation when we have large number of examples. So for example, here we have 10,000 examples. So in that case, we are still able to discover the symbolic representation, which is already a good result. But when we add the constraints, then we can push, let's say, the learning towards regimes where we have much less training data. So for example, where we have 1,000 training examples. So this is a promising results for the development of the solution for solutions in the small data regime. And actually, our solution enables us to use reasoners, existing reasoners, for learning. Okay, so for summarizing, we have seen today an interpretation and analysis of most popular self-supervised learning objectives in terms of Bayesian analysis. We have also seen a unified view of generative and self-supervised learning models, our GEDI framework. We have also seen a solution that instantiates such framework and enables you to leverage the best of both worlds, both of generative and self-supervised learning approaches. Thank you for listening. If you are interested about this research, please follow me on Twitter, or if you have any questions or any suggestions, please drop me an email. Bye.